All right. So you've sent in some really interesting stuff about how we get like new drugs and devices out to people who need them quickly.
Right.
Like those fast track approval pathways,
Yeah.
things like breakthrough therapy, EUA, and accelerated approval. It
Yeah.
seems like it's way more than just knowing like what those acronyms stand for, right?
Absolutely it is, yeah. You've gathered some great source material here.
Yeah.
What we want to do with this deep dive is kind of go beyond just like defining what those terms are
Mm-hmm.
and really understand why these pathways even exist in the first place.
Right.
And like how they kind of navigate this complex world of getting these treatments to patients faster.
Yeah.
And really dig into like this whole idea of balancing speed with the necessary safety checks.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have the standard approval process,
Right.
which is very like thorough.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when you're talking about people with serious conditions, time is so critical.
Absolutely.
So I guess let's start with that basic question. Like,
Yeah.
why do we even have these expedited routes?
Yeah.
What's like the core driver behind their creation?
Well, as your sources highlight, the traditional drug...
They're trying to offer that quicker access to therapies that show promise in situations where, like, the need is really huge.
Right, where it matters most.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that speaks directly to, our listeners' desire for that timely and thorough information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You want it quickly, but you also want to make sure it's good.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And the real, like, I guess, foundational principle here is this careful balancing act between like reasonable efficiency and those essential safety checks.
Right.
You know, it's this constant navigation of how do we speed this up?
Right.
How do we make these life-saving things available quickly?
Yeah.
But also, like, not compromise the fundamental evaluations of whether it's actually safe and whether it actually works.
Right. Right.
And what's really interesting is how each of these different pathways kind of approaches that balance in a slightly different way.
Right. Okay, so these fast-track approvals aren't just this one, like, monolithic
Right.
thing.
Not at all.
Are there some, like, overarching principles or mechanisms that, like, tie them together?
There are definitely, like, common elements.
Yeah, what are the common elements?
You can think of, like, fast-track approval pathways
Oh, okay.
as kind of a set of tools, regulatory tools, and they're really designed to accelerate the development and review of therapies for things that are serious, right?
Right.
Serious conditions, unmet medical needs.
Yeah.
And some common mechanisms that you'll see are things like priority review.
Okay.
Where the regulatory agencies will actually expedite their assessment timelines.
Right.
So they're going to look at it faster.
Yeah.
You'll see things like rolling submissions.
Okay.
Where companies can actually submit completed sections of their application.
Oh,
as they become available, rather than waiting till the whole thing's done.
I see.
So they can get the ball rolling sooner.
Yeah, okay.
And you'll also typically see, like, more frequent guidance from regulatory bodies like the FDA throughout the development process.
Right.
So it's much more of a collaborative, like, back and forth than it would be traditionally.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess at a personal level for you listening to this, why is this important to understand? Like, how might these fast-track approvals directly affect you or your loved ones?
So in a very real sense, if you or a loved one is facing, a serious illness, this means that you're more likely to access those, like, potentially life-saving treatments sooner.
Right.
When a new therapy comes out and it looks really promising,
right,
these expedited routes aim to, like, get it through all that regulatory stuff and into the hands of patients faster than traditional methods.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Beyond that direct impact, this system really fosters, like, a more dynamic environment for medical innovation.
Okay.
So, like, the possibility of having this faster route to market for a really, really, like, groundbreaking treatment, that could be a huge incentive for, pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies to invest in researching and developing those novel therapies.
Right, right.
And this kind of competitive landscape that it creates ultimately leads to just a broader range of advanced treatments that will eventually become available.
Right. So it's not just about speed in a vacuum. It's about, like, spurring on more innovation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if we even think bigger picture, like, public health crises.
Yeah.
Like the pandemic that we all just lived through.
Right.
these pathways become absolutely essential.
Yeah.
It gives the regulators the flexibility they need to rapidly deploy, essential medical countermeasures.
Right.
Things like vaccines and treatments on a really large scale to respond to that threat.
Yeah, we saw that.
A huge impact.
Yeah.
Also, these expedited pathways can sometimes offer some economic advantages to the companies making these drugs because they shorten the development timeline.
Right.
But ideally, those efficiencies are passed on, to patients, and they actually make those therapies more accessible.
Right. So the benefits kind of ripple outward from that initial speed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, the driving force behind all this is better outcomes and faster relief for people who are suffering from these, really serious and often lethal diseases.
Right.
And that's a benefit that I think we can all really get behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into the specifics.
Okay.
So the first pathway we mentioned was breakthrough therapy. What are the defining characteristics of something that gets that designation?
So breakthrough therapy designation, as your sources point out, is reserved for drugs that show what they call substantial clinical improvement over available therapies for serious or life-threatening conditions.
Right.
And this isn't just a little bit better.
Right.
It needs to be significantly better.
Right.
And it was established here in the U.S. in 2012.
Okay.
And basically, it's a signal to the FDA that, hey, this therapy could have a major impact.
Right.
So in return, the FDA will give them more intensive guidance and a faster review process to hopefully get it out there.
So when they say substantial clinical improvement, how do they determine that so early on? What kind of evidence are they looking for?
The criteria are pretty specific.
Okay.
First of all, the drug has to treat a serious or life-threatening condition. So you're talking things with high morbidity or mortality, like advanced cancers, or really severe genetic disorders.
Right.
The second thing is that they have to have this preliminary clinical evidence.
Oh, okay.
And usually this is from phase 1 or phase 2 trials.
Right.
And it has to suggest a substantial improvement over existing therapies.
Right.
So again, not just a little bit better.
Right.
It could be, greater efficacy in treating the disease, or it could be a big improvement in safety, or how tolerable it is compared to what's already out there.
Right.
So that early data really needs to show a big signal of potential benefit.
So it's early promise, but a high bar.
High bar, exactly.
Okay, and what does the enhanced guidance actually look like?
It's a lot more frequent and direct interaction
Mm-hmm.
between the FDA review team
Right.
and the company developing the drug. So they might get assistance with, how to design the trials well.
Right.
They might get feedback on data as it emerges.
Okay.
Help with navigating potential regulatory hurdles.
I see.
Think of it as you've got this expert consultant with you throughout the entire development journey.
Okay.
And it really helps optimize the process.
Right. Yeah.
And it also facilitates things like we talked about before, like priority review and rolling submission.
Right.
So the FDA can start looking at data as soon as it's ready.
Yeah.
They don't have to wait till the whole thing's done.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's much more collaborative.
Much more collaborative.
And expedited.
Exactly.
So are there any well-known examples of drugs that have used this pathway?
Yeah. There are some really good ones that your sources point out.
Okay.
So Keytruda, which is, I think a lot of people have heard of this.
Yeah.
A really important immunotherapy drug.
Right.
That's used to treat lots of different cancers.
Yeah.
That got breakthrough therapy designation.
Okay.
Similarly, Kymriah, which is a pioneering gene therapy for certain types of leukemia.
Wow.
And Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, and that's for, young children.
Right.
All of these went through that pathway.
Wow. So those are definitely examples of things that have had a major impact.
Huge impact, yeah.
Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about emergency use authorization or EUA. I think we
all know that one now.
Yeah, we all became very familiar with this during the recent public health crisis.
Right.
So what's like the fundamental purpose of an EUA?
So the core purpose of an EUA is to allow for the temporary use of unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved products during public health emergencies.
Right.
And the key words here are like temporary and public health emergency. So the FDA will grant this when they decide there are no like adequate, approved, and available alternatives to address the emergency.
So it's like a way to get these potentially helpful tools into the hands of healthcare providers and the public when there's literally no other option.
Right. In a crisis.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what are the conditions that need to be met for the FDA to issue one?
Several things have to be true.
Okay.
First, the known or potential benefits of this thing have to outweigh any potential risks.
Right.
And that's based on whatever scientific evidence is available at the time.
Okay.
Second, the emergency has to be something really serious or life-threatening, caused by something like a pandemic or, even like a bioterrorism event.
Right.
The third thing is there needs to be a reasonable belief that the product may be effective at, diagnosing or preventing or treating whatever it is.
Right.
And that's usually based on like some preliminary data.
Okay.
And then lastly, and crucially, there cannot be any other adequate, approved, and available alternatives.
Right.
So it has to be the only option, basically.
Right. It's like a risk-benefit calculation under really extreme circumstances.
Extraordinary circumstances.
The time is everything, right?
Exactly.
And options are limited.
Yeah.
So we saw this used very extensively during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Big time.
Can you give us some concrete examples of how that was applied?
COVID was the perfect example of this.
Yeah.
The rapid authorization of those vaccines that we all know about.
Right.
Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. Right. That was all thanks to EUAs, that allowed them to get those out there so quickly.
Yeah.
Similarly, those antiviral treatments like remdesivir and Paxlovid,
right,
those were granted EUAs to help people manage the infection.
Right.
And prevent really severe outcome.
Right.
The diagnostic tools.
Yeah.
Like PCR and antigen tests for COVID.
Right.
That was EUA.
Yeah.
That allowed that to happen.
Right.
Even PPE.
Yeah.
Like N95 masks and like medical gloves.
Right.
That was authorized under EUA.
Wow.
Because there were such critical shortages.
Right.
And your sources really point out that these had a huge public health impact.
Right. I mean, it's hard to overstate the role that EUAs played during that time.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, but the sources also raised some really important limitations and potential concerns of using EUAs.
Right.
So what are some of those nuances that we need to be aware of?
One of the big things is these products, they haven't gone through the same really rigorous, lengthy review that a fully approved product.
Right. Yeah.
So the data on safety and efficacy, it's still being collected, it's still being evaluated.
Right.
And unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to misinformation spreading and the public just being really unsure about things.
Right. Right.
Also, it's not a permanent approval, right? So the FDA can revoke it at any time.
Okay.
If new data emerges suggesting that maybe it's not effective or if safety concerns come up.
Right.
So it's very much conditional.
Okay.
And it's tied to that ongoing emergency.
Right.
And then there's also this potential for people to see this and think, oh, this was hastily approved.
Yeah.
And that can damage public trust in the whole regulatory science world.
Right. Right. There's
a lot of nuance there.
Yeah, those are really important caveats.
Right.
Finally, let's talk about the accelerated approval pathway. So how does this differ from breakthrough therapy and EUAs?
So accelerated approval is really focused on providing that early approval for drugs, for serious or life-threatening things.
Right.
But the key difference here is the type of evidence that they use for that initial approval.
Okay.
So instead of relying on direct measures of clinical benefit, like Did people survive longer?
Right.
Did their disease not progress as quickly?
Right.
This looks at what they call surrogate or intermediate clinical endpoints.
Okay.
Which is a fancy way of saying these are markers.
Right.
So things like, did the tumor shrink?
Right.
Or, are the levels of a certain biomarker changing?
Okay.
That they think are reasonably likely to predict that there will be a clinical benefit.
So they're approving it based on things that suggest a good outcome will happen, even if it's not fully proven yet.
Yeah. The long-term impact isn't totally clear.
Yeah.
The FDA is basically saying, okay, this early evidence looks good.
Yeah.
We're going to let you use this treatment.
Yeah.
But you got to keep studying it.
Right.
And prove to us that those initial predictions were right.
I see.
And so that leads to this really crucial requirement.
Yeah.
Which is if you get this accelerated approval, you have to do these post-marketing confirmatory trials.
Okay.
To verify that it actually does what we thought it was going to do.
Okay.
And if those trials fail,
the
FDA can take it away.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it's faster, but it's not...
It's faster, but there are strings attached.
Yeah, there's a big obligation for follow-up.
Right.
And the potential... That could be reversed.
It could all go away.
Yeah. So what are the benefits?
So the main benefit is
it
allows people to get these treatments sooner.
Okay.
Especially when there aren't any other effective therapies out there. Right. So for people with these serious conditions, this could mean they get treatment years earlier.
Wow.
Than they would have otherwise.
Right.
If it had to go through the traditional process.
Okay. Are there any examples of drugs that have been approved this way?
Some good examples are Tecentriq.
Okay.
Which is an immunotherapy that's used for a lot of different cancers. Aduhelm.
Okay.
Which is a big one, a controversial one for Alzheimer's.
Right, yeah.
And then Exondys 51, which is a treatment for Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Okay.
So it shows you it's being used across a lot of different disease areas.
Right, where there's a big need.
Huge need, yeah.
Yeah, but it sounds like there are some risks.
There are some risks, yeah.
And challenges with this approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So like we said, there's that risk of withdrawal.
Right.
If those later trials fail. And that's a problem because if patients were relying on that drug.
Right.
And it gets taken away.
Right.
That can be really disruptive to their care.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, the initial approval is based on those surrogate endpoints.
Right.
So we don't know for sure what the long-term benefits will be until those confirmatory trials are done.
Yeah.
So doctors and patients, they're making decisions with less complete information than they normally would.
Yeah.
And then also, once you get that accelerated approval, the regulatory agencies are really watching you.
Okay.
So there's tons of data collection going on, and they could change the labeling on the drug.
Right.
They could even withdraw it.
Wow.
If that data isn't looking good.
Yeah. So it seems like each of these pathways has its own specific context and its own set of
its own pros and cons.
Yeah, trade-offs. Yeah. And I know our sources include a table that kind of summarizes those differences.
Right.
So maybe we could just briefly highlight the core distinctions.
Yeah, the table's a great way to see it all at once.
Yeah, yeah.
So you can see the purpose of each pathway.
Right.
So breakthrough is for really big improvement.
Right.
EUA is for emergencies.
Right.
And accelerated approval is for when we see those promising early indicators.
Right.
It also shows you what the criteria are. The main benefits, how quickly you can get it.
Yeah.
And then any risks or requirements.
Yeah.
So it's a nice, quick snapshot.
Yeah.
To compare them.
Okay. And now with all this focus on speed, obviously a natural question is, what about safety?
Yeah.
What's in place to make sure that these fast-track treatments are still safe for patients?
Patient safety is always the, #1 priority.
Yeah.
And your sources really emphasize this.
Yeah.
So they talk about things like post-marketing surveillance.
Right.
So once the treatment is out there, they're not just okay, see you later.
Yeah.
They're watching it.
Yeah.
They're tracking those adverse events. They're assessing the long-term safety and effectiveness.
Yeah.
There's also a big focus on communicating those risks and benefits to healthcare providers and the public.
Yeah.
So everybody can make like an informed decision.
Right, right.
And importantly, the agencies, they have the power to take action if they need to.
Okay.
So they can modify the approval, they can add warnings to it, they can even take it off the market completely if there are safety concerns.
So it's reassuring to know that, like that focus on safety is still there.
It never goes away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about the FDA here in the U.S.
Right.
Do other countries have similar mechanisms?
Oh, yeah. This is a global thing.
Okay.
So the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, they have their own similar pathways. Like, for instance, conditional marketing authorization.
Okay.
That's where they can approve medicines early.
Okay.
If they address an unmet medical need.
Right.
And they don't have all the data they normally would.
Right.
But as long as the benefits outweigh the risks.
Okay.
And the company promises to get that data.
Right, right.
Then it's okay.
Yeah.
They also have this thing called Prime.
Oh, right.
Which gives like extra support to developing innovative medicines.
Okay.
If they could help patients that, you know, don't have any other options.
Right.
And they've got a pathway for approval under exceptional circumstances.
Okay.
Which is used when they just can't get all that clinical data.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Right. So it's like that underlying principle of trying to balance like that need with that careful evaluation.
Right. Need versus like carefulness.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. It seems to be universal.
It really is.
Okay. And your sources point out that, you know, other regions like Japan, with their Sakigake designation, China priority review pathway, India expedited review system, like they all have these things.
They all have ways to speed it up.
Yeah. So while the specifics are different, that goal of getting those products to patients faster seems to be
shared all over the world.
Yeah, like a global priority.
It is, yeah.
It's interesting to see that like convergence on this issue. So like